Hi class, it's Bill Berry back with the last video in the Arrays series. In the first couple of videos we learned a lot about how you can create and manipulate arrays, but we have still a few things to show that are going to add some nuance and some ability to manipulate arrays in more interesting ways. I don't expect that you'll use a lot of these in your projects. I'm keeping the projects fairly simple, but these are great things to know about if you want to create projects that are a little more exciting and do more interesting work. So let's jump down to that and take a peek at where what we need to do today. So the useful array methods, I'm listing about 5 of them here that are all of interest, and so just be aware that they exist. If you need them, you can always look up examples of how these things work. The first one is called concat, and concat is a method that will let you take one array and add the entire contents of another array to it. So for instance, I can take my list, let's say, of IT 102 students, that's an array that has a bunch of students in it, and then to it I can concatenate another array that contains all my IT 125 students. What results in this is a newly created array that contains all of the students from both lists, and I can then store that in yet another array called all students. So concat is a powerful way to take two arrays and combine them and generate a new one that I can then save. Another one that we want to hit is toString. And if you call the toString method, it's going to put all of the things together in the array and put commas in between them and return them as one big list, in this case a big string. So in this case, if I have students and I call toString method, I'm going to get Pat, Chris, Parker, Zane. Now this should give you a really good clue, because remember when we did a video or so ago when we displayed the entire list by saying document.write students, that's what this is actually doing. We didn't call the toString method, but that's really what it was doing. If you just try to write the whole array, it's going to imply that you wanted to do toString, and you get this kind of result. So that's a powerful way if you want to display things on one easy line and you don't want to need to make it pretty, you can just use the toString method. Now here comes another powerful one. You can take one array and you can ask for a subset of it, and it will give you back another array that consists of that subset. The way that this works is you say the name of the array and then you put a dot and then you say slice. I am slicing up this array to create another array. And this says I want to start at element 1, remember that's the second element in the array, and I want to go to just before 3. So not quite 3, but 1, 2, just before 3. In this case, that means 1 and 2. So that's going to pull out Chris and Parker. It's going to return a new list that you can save in another variable if you like. You can also just put a single parameter here, and that says I want to go 2 through the end. If you don't put a comma and another parameter, it's going to go 2 through the end. So in this case, it'll be Parker and Zane if you happen to have this list that looks like this. So slice is a great way to say, I just want a little subset of my array. I just want some of the elements back. Use slice. And this is sort of common. If you work with Python, you will see that there's a very similar kind of list manipulation stuff. This is very reminiscent of what you'll see in Python. So that's 3, concat, toString, slice. There's a couple more. One interesting one is called indexOf, and that says I want you to tell me if the thing that I am asking you about is there and where it is in the list. So if I ask, tell it the name of the array, put a dot, say indexOf, notice there's a capital O, and then inside the parentheses I put the thing of interest. I'm saying, where is Chris in this list? And it will return an integer saying, in this case, 1. You can store that if you like, or you can use it in some other way, but that says, yeah, Chris is here, and he is or she is at position 1, right? Chris is at position 1. If you ask the question of somebody who's not in the list, in this case I'm saying, where's Zach? I don't have a Zach in the list. It will return a -1. Now that's an invalid position, right? Array indexes or positions start at 0. So it returns a -1 as a signal to you that says Zach's not here. So you can search to find out whether something's already in the list, and that's pretty cool. Keep in mind, look carefully and think about casing here and try some experiments. If you look for capital C Chris versus lower C Chris, what are you going to get? And last but not least, there's a super powerful thing called Splice. Splicing lets you add things and remove things at the same time, either or at the same time. It's very powerful, but it's a weird syntax. So I create my student list and then I say, I want to splice. So take the list and splice. This first thing says at position 1, starting at position 1, the next parameter says how many students to remove. So at position 1, remove one student. That's going to remove Chris from the list. So at this moment, if we stopped here and just put parentheses, we would end up with Pat, Parker, and Zane, because Chris would have been removed. But we continue, and we say, at that position, same position, I want you to add Blaine and Landry. You can add as many of them as you want here. So that says, at position 1, remove one student, and then at that same position, add the rest of these students. So now the list is going to be Pat, Blaine, Landry, Parker, and Zane. So Splice is very powerful. It lets you extract and remove things from the list, but you can also add things at that same thing. So you're doing surgery at one particular location in the list, which is very powerful, and that's where the word splice comes from. You're literally splicing the list and creating, you're updating the list and doing that surgery. So extremely powerful, little bit strange syntax, but there you go. It does work. All right. Last idea here, we are looking at a challenge, and I highly recommend that you do some things like this. Little tiny games are a great way to practice what you've learned, and if you can do this little game on your own, you've really put together a lot of the topics that we've talked about all quarter long. This will require loops, iteration, loops and selection. It'll use arrays. Like, it really does cover a lot of cool stuff, and it makes you think a little bit, right? It exercises your logic knowledge a little bit. So this game would be called Pairs Win. And we're just going to make a single player game, and that says we're going to start with 5 cards. Now you might see that the game is either too hard or too easy with 5, so you might want to make that easy to adjust, right? Set it up in a variable so you can change it to 7 if you want, or 4, whatever you think. And so start with 5 cards and deal 5 cards to the player. Again, we can pretend like we have elsewhere, just column 1 through 10, pretend all face cards are 10s and aces are low, right? So just pretend it's just going to be 1 to 10. And then store those in an array, right? So the cards are dealt and they're stored in an array. And then you display that dealt hand, right? You show the player what their hand is that's been dealt. Then here comes the fun part. Analyze the hand to see if there are any pairs in there. And if so, if there are any pairs, you display a message that says player wins. If there are no pairs, player loses. Simple enough, right? But it takes some logic. It is not as straightforward as you might think. So let's write some pseudocode to help you. But if you want to, just pause the video or stop the video and go and try this, and then come back and resume and look at the pseudocode next. All right, so here's some ideas to get you started. All right, so we have to create a variable called numCards, let's say, and set it to 5. We're going to start with an empty hand because we don't have any knowledge yet what it's going to be. And then we're going to deal some cards. Right now, deal cards has some logic associated with it because you're going to have to deal 5 cards. Hint, hint, there are 5 of them, right? Or at this point, however many it says here, you're going to deal those things. Then you're going to display that hand. There's different ways you can do that. This is the most interesting part, analyzing the hand. So one thing you find is that sorting the hand makes this easier because the cards are in random order. If you sort it, at least the pairs have to be next to each other, right? So that's a big clue here. We're going to perhaps create a variable called win, and we're going to set it to false. We haven't used Booleans much, but this is a great place to do it. Or you could use a string, you could use a number, right? You can set a string to false in quotes if you want, whatever you want to do. Then here's the fun part. We have to check each pair and see if the card at this spot is the same as the card at the next spot. So here's the clue. We got to compare card 0 to card 1, then card 1 to card 2, and you got to keep going until you've compared the last pair, which is going to be num cards minus 2 to num cards minus 1, right? Because of the way that array positioning works, that's the last comparison that you need to do. This is the interesting part here, and it's a little bit tricky to get right. But if you find a pair in this comparison, you need to somehow log the fact or note the fact that they won, right? You set win to true, where we assumed it was false because we hadn't found any pairs yet. Once you've finished all that scanning and you know whether you found any pairs, you display the outcome. So this is a great challenge to prove that you have understood everything that's going on here and that you can write a small program. It's still not a very long program, but it's got some logic, right? It uses a lot. Now, if you really want the challenge, let me show you one extra challenge bit. Once you get this working, here's a challenge that becomes much more interesting. First, don't just announce the win or loss, but say what the highest pair was, right? Because they could potentially have multiple pairs. You can test this with more cards, right? So you want to say, hey, the pairs that you won and the highest pair was a 10 or was an 8 or whatever that was. So that's a bit of a challenge. But then the real challenge is, harder challenge by far, make it a multiplayer game. You can do this by copying and pasting a whole bunch of code, right? For instance, you can create player 1 hand, that's an array, player 2 hand, player 3 hand, player 4 hand, but you're going to find that that's very unsatisfying and makes you feel a little bit icky because you are copying and pasting a heck of a lot of code. So that's not the way, right? That's not the best way to do that. You can make it work, but there seems like there should be a more elegant solution. So really think about how you're going to store those multiple hands, and that's going to take you into some interesting territory if you really want to do it in a very elegant way. So if you want to investigate something like this, maybe this game, maybe something similar to this game, and make a really nice UI and add all these features, you could consider forms, make something really pretty on the screen, etc. That could actually be the basis for a quarter project, right? So if you want to avoid the exam and want to do a quarterly project, think about something like this, maybe not identical, but something on the order of this or a little bit fancier would be a decent project. So that brings us to the end of this video series on arrays, and it also, for the moment, finishes up the course. So we have covered a lot of the basics that you need to know about, not just in JavaScript, but basic concepts that you can take forward into any language. If you go to study Python, you go to study Java, all of these concepts that we've learned can be put into use there. The language syntax may vary a little bit, but the concepts are there, and I hope that you have taken away a lot of good information from this that you'll use in your future academic activities. So thanks for watching these, and do let me know if you have questions.